Okay, on to the next part in this little series, this time where I talk about a Russian specialization. Only one, mainly because I'm not familiar enough with the Russian military organization and its equipment to be able to formulate more than one. I'm not saying that you couldn't, I'm just saying that I'm not familiar enough with it. And honestly, that drawback is going to come up more than once when I talk about this. The idea behind the specialization is that it's kind of like a combination between SOCOM and Striker Cav, or maybe SOCOM and motorized infantry. Basically, what you would have is you would have a good amount of recon, a lot of good quality infantry. You would have some vehicle points, but not too many, a large amount of support points, a decent air tab, but you may not have any helicopter points. Honestly, I could probably recommend a couple, like maybe the MI-17 or the MI-2, I believe it is, but I can't really think of anything to really fill out a helicopter tab, which kind of sucks. Although the alternative would be like just putting 250 points in the helicopter tab for maybe, I don't know, 2 or 3 MI-17s. It doesn't really make much sense to do that. Now, ideally, I don't plan to rabbit on as long as I did last time. And yes, I know I said that last time, but honestly, I don't think I'm going to have that much to talk about this time. Hopefully. The core of this specialization would be relatively high quality infantry from things like the FSB and the GRU, at least as near as I understand it. The problem, and again, this is going to come up more than once in this video, is that I do not understand the way that these organizations are, well, organized. I don't understand how the FSB and the GRU are organized and how they're separate from each other. I don't understand exactly how the armed wings of these organizations are organized and what they're equipped with and how that could translate in the game. The Spetsnaz GRU, which is apparently the armed wing of the GRU, is already kind of represented in game. It's a 6-man squad over in motorized infantry. But, from my understanding, Spetsnaz GRU encompasses a wide variety of the kind of special forces that Russia has, including the PDSS, which is in coastal troops. I'm not entirely sure how it fits together, so I'm almost certainly going to get things wrong in this video. So this is basically how I understand it. That said, I'm not entirely sure I need to understand it to be able to recommend units for the game. Basically, to summarize, I am almost certainly going to get things wrong, or I'm almost certainly going to misunderstand things. But like I said, the idea behind this specialization is to have relatively high quality infantry with some support elements, recon elements, vehicle, and at least a decent air tab. The framework of this specialization would probably be the Russian National Guard. Now, exactly how the National Guard differs from Rosvardia, I'm not entirely sure. I think they are the same thing, but Rosvardia may also be a sort of like riot police slash SWAT team element within the Russian National Guard, and that's basically what I'm going to assume it is here. Again, I may very well get that wrong. There's also Oman. Now, Oman might actually be the military police slash heavily armed SWAT team that I was thinking of when I said Rosvardia just now. Again, I'm not sure. As for the infantry makeup, you're probably going to have several basic squads. I mean, I'm imagining that's going to be roughly like SOCOM, in that you have several basic squads and then maybe one elite squad in the infantry tab. So what you're probably going to have is you're likely just going to have a basic infantry squad, which may or may not be made up of like National Guardsmen, for example. And to support this, you're probably going to have things like manpad squads and ATGM squads as well. You may also have machine gun teams, things like the PKP or the Cords squads, or rather the squads that get the PKPs and the Cords over in motorized and mechanized infantry. I think it's motorized infantry. I'll have to check. Okay, just checked. It is in fact mechanized infantry, not motorized infantry. As for a CQC slash door kicker slash combat engineer like infantry unit, you might have. I'm just gonna call them Oman because I think Rosvardia is a name for the Russian National Guard as a whole. But you would have them, and the idea is basically like a SWAT team slash riot police. So relatively short range guns like, for example, MP5s or the Russian equivalent, shotguns. You might have a few thermobaric rocket launchers, and they might even get flashbangs. At the same time, however, I don't expect them to be especially heavily armed, and they would be almost useless against basically any armored vehicle whatsoever. Although, to be fair, you can basically say the same thing about most combat engineers or door kicking teams in general. As for the elite infantry, kind of like the SSO and motorized, I have seen reference to a Spetsnaz FSB, and I assume this is similar to like the Spetsnaz VDV, the Spetsnaz VMF, and the Spetsnaz GRU, but I have absolutely no idea what the Spetsnaz VDV do, what they're equipped with, what their organization structure is like, or anything like that. However, what's notable is that there's some interesting weapons that are associated with the FSB, including a series of a revolver handgun, which probably wouldn't make it into the game, and then an assault rifle, the SHAK 12, like Shack 12, for lack of a better term, the Shack 12, that is chambered in 12.7 by 55 millimeter. This is a very large bullet. In fact, this is the same diameter round as what the M2 Browning and the Cord shoot, although the bullet itself is shorter. This could be an interesting cartridge to fit out a Spetsnaz FSB team, potentially making them surprisingly effective in firefights. Maybe the gun doesn't necessarily have a whole bunch of range or a whole bunch of penetration, but it does do a lot of damage, because what you're effectively doing is you're firing a very large, very heavy bullet. However, the muzzle velocities are relatively low, and the maximum range is also comparatively short, so what you're probably looking at is the kind of weaponry that you'd expect to arm a Spetsnaz FSB door-kicking team, kind of like the CQC variant of SSO. And these guys may also get flashbangs if the Oman team don't. Now, for vehicles to transport the infantry, you're likely going to be looking at a variety of different MRAP types. There's two primary types that I've been able to find, the Kamaz Typhoon and the Ural Typhoon. I imagine these are going to be MRAPs, kind of like the Typhoon in the recon, or the transport vehicle in the recon tab and the VDV specialization. What's interesting is that both of them appear to have the same basic characteristics and perform the same basic roles, so I'm not sure which is which. They both concede around 16, they both have about the same axis speed, they're both 3-axle vehicles, and they could both be armed with 50 caliber or maybe a grenade launcher in an RWS. I suppose you could have both of them, although it would seem kind of redundant. Assuming we're talking about a squad size of 8 here for the basic infantry, you might have one that's only limited to, say, 8 people, and then one that can carry 16. However, I'm not entirely sure how they would differ. Mainly because, according to the things that I've read, they can both carry 16, so I don't know what the 8-man version would have to offer to incentivize using it over the 16-man version. Aside from that, I haven't really found many vehicles that could be used. I suppose if you do separate the infantry up into 4-man teams, kind of like you do in coastal troops and motorized infantry, you could add vehicles like the BMD-1 and the BMD-3. Now, the BMD-1 is basically a BMP-1, but can be thrown out the back of a plane and still expect to be used afterwards. Basically, it's like a BMP-2, but with a BMP-1's turret, so with the 73mm Grom gun. The BMD-3 is a heavily modernized version of the BMD-2. Like the BMD-2, it still has a single 30mm autocannon, but it would possess some improvements. over the BMD-2. What these improvements are, I honestly don't know. But apparently there was enough improvements for the or not the Russians, it was actually the Soviets, to go from BMD-2 to BMD-3. And then the BMD-3 was ultimately replaced by the BMD-4, which was replaced by the BMD-4M, which is, if memory serves, where you get the almost BMP-3 style turret with the 100mm and the 30mm autocannon. But you can add that for the smaller squads to use. And in a way, that would also add some interoperability with things like the VDV specialization. As for recon, you would have a variety of things to choose from here. I'm working on the assumption that this specialization has 1,000 recon points, so if you combine this with something like motorized, you're going to have a lot of recon to play with. And that's kind of the point, mainly because this is kind of supposed to be like a Russian version of SOCOM, as I said before. Now, as for the kind of infantry that you have, again, I'm not entirely sure, mainly because of what I said before about me not understanding how how things like the FSB and the GRU are organized and what kind of organizational structures are within them that can be translated into infantry units in the game. That said, however, there are a few ideas for things that I think would be interesting. Firstly, for transports for the infantry and the recon tab, you can always go back to things like the MRAPs that I mentioned before, the Kamaz Typhoons. There are 4-axle versions of them. Granted, there's also 8-axle versions of them. So you could probably have something like the Typhoons or the VDV Typhoon in the VDV specialization that I mentioned earlier. However, what might set this specialization apart would be its use of drones. And there's 3 primary types that I know of that could be very interesting. Now, at least 2 of these are derivatives of the Orion UAV in VDV. All 3 of them are made by the same company, but I know that at least 2 of them are derivatives of the Orion. First up, we have the Kronstadt Helios RLD. This is a large propeller-driven UAV that was intended specifically to be a reconnaissance and surveillance platform. This is a bit of a departure from the surveillance/strike platforms that a lot of Russian UAVs can be used as in-game. As I said before, the Helios is a very large drone. While it doesn't weigh nearly as much as the Global Hawk, it has almost the same physical dimensions. So what we might be looking at here is something akin to basically a Russian version of the Global Hawk, fitting that same high altitude, long endurance role. And in game, I would expect that mainly to translate in that it has optics similar to what the Global Hawk has, rather than the Orion, which has optics similar to like the MQ-1C or the MQ-9. So, in short, this could basically act like a Russian equivalent of the Global Hawk. There's also the Sokol Altis, if I pronounced that correctly, which can also be thought as a Global Hawk-esque UAV. It's primarily designed as a long endurance UAV. It doesn't have the same service ceiling as the Global Hawk, but it would serve the same basic function, at least in real life. In game, I suppose it could be treated again the same basic way, so you can generally pick between one or the other, I suppose. I mean, I don't see any reason why you couldn't have both, aside from the fact that it would kind of be redundant. Next up would be the Kronstadt Sirius. This is a twin turboprop UAV, which, I mean, in itself is kind of interesting, that has a fairly decent weapons load, all things considered. Although, I say decent weapons load, it looks like it's predominantly a bunch of small bombs, like 220, 250 pound bombs. Something roughly akin to things like the Stormbreaker, which is kind of interesting that none of the US UAVs can actually carry that. But I digress. Although it does look like it could carry some 500 kilogram bombs, at least if I'm reading this correctly. This could be thought of as kind of like a cross between the current Orion and maybe something like the MQ-9. Next up, we have the Kronstadt Grom, and this I'm kind of imagining as an MQ-9 equivalent. It is basically, it's supposed to be like a sort of loyal wingman style UCAV, kind of like Actually, now that I think about it, contemporaries would probably be like things like the XQ58 or the MQ25. But the idea here is that it's, at least the idea that I imagine it, is as an MQ9 equivalent. For one, it's supposed to carry a number of air to surface weapons, including 250 kilogram and 500 kilogram bombs and KH 38 air to surface missiles. You could probably carry a total of four of these. So think of it like a UAV slash strike platform in much the same way as the MQ9 is. That said, I don't expect it to be quite as capable as the MQ9, and subsequently, I don't expect it to be quite as expensive. Just like I don't expect the Cirrus to be quite as capable as the MQ9 either, and again, I don't expect it to be quite as expensive. To come back to the infantry for a moment, another transport vehicle that could be used would be the Tiger, TIGR. This is basically a light infantry mobility vehicle slash quasi MRAP. It's a 4x4 platform, and there's a number of variants of it. So it's probably going to appear more than once in this specialization. I mean, I know of an ATGM variant and an air defense variant, which I will mention later. But the idea here would basically be as like a light transport vehicle. Interestingly enough, there I have seen mounts on top of it for a combination Cord and AGS 30, I believe. I think it's an AGS 30. It's either an AGS 17 or an AGS 30. So something kind of like the twin 50 cal Mark 19 turrets that you see on either the M1117 or the AAVP. Moving on to vehicles, and this is where things might get a little bit retro. Now, I already mentioned the Tiger, and there is an ATGM version of the Tiger. Specifically, there's an ATGM version of the Tiger that has the same kind of missile arrangement as on the Cornet D1 in the VDV specialization. Specifically, it has two launcher assemblies, for lack of a better word, each one housing four missiles that can pop up, much like the pair of quad Cornets customization option on the Cornet D1. This would probably act as your basic ATGM vehicle, or at least as the Specialization's primary ATGM vehicle. And that's not particularly heavily armored, but you would be able to, but you would basically have 8 Cornets, possibly even Cornet M's on standby. So this is something that could be pretty dangerous, but it could also be pretty expensive. Another issue is that it's on a relatively lightly armored platform, so I don't expect that it would be particularly hard to destroy, even if you give it the option of up armoring it with things like cage armor or slat armor. Oh yes, because I keep forgetting it. Another infantry transport vehicle may be the BTR 70. And while I'm remembering things that I have forgotten so quickly, another vehicle for the recon tab might be the Vodnik, if I'm pronouncing this correctly. This is basically a light infantry mobility vehicle that's based off of the before mentioned Tiger. However, it is armed with a 14.5 millimeter gun turret, kind of similar to what you see on the BTR 80 or the BRDM 2. That, and I'm not entirely sure it would actually have a seating. I'm not entirely sure it would actually have room to seat people in it, because I mean I've seen a reference that it has the ability to seat 6 passengers, but I've also seen reference that the interior seating arrangement's kind of weird, like with the driver and the passengers sitting one behind the other. So I'm not entirely sure whether or not that would act like something like the BRDM2 or if it would have infantry carrying capability. Overall, I think that's kind of interesting to speculate. Anyway, back to vehicles. Now, for this particular specialization, you would have some tanks, but they would be old tanks. I'm talking like T-62s and T-64s for that matter. The idea is that you would have things like T-62s and T-64s primarily as fire support vehicles. Think something akin to the MPF, or maybe even the MGS when it comes to, well, probably not the MGS because I mean, they are technically tanks, so they would have some armor. They wouldn't be quite as easy to kill as a striker, but you're still probably not going to be face tanking 120 millimeter Sabo with these things in the way that you can if you're using a T14. Honestly, the T62 would probably just serve as a M10 style fire support vehicle rather than an actual tank. I mean, to be fair, a bad tank is better than no tank, and if the other side doesn't have a tank, it doesn't matter if you're rolling up with a T62, you still have a tank. Of course, if the other side has a javelin or pretty much any kind of AT, then your tank is probably going to go from a tank to a pile of burning twisted metal very quickly, but that's honestly not going to be any different than something like the T-72B, or you can make an argument for the Striker MGS or the MPF. And the T-64 might be the slightly fancier, slightly more expensive option. That said, it's still a vehicle from the mid 1960s, so I'm not entirely sure you're going to have much in the way of usability, or you're not going to get much in the way of usability out of it. You're probably not going to have anything akin to like T-72B3Ms, T-80 BVMs, or T-90Ms, but it would still bring a 120 millimeter, or not 120 millimeter, a 125 millimeter gun that could shoot semi-modern ammunition. I mean, at the very least, it could shoot a decent HE shell. So, again, you're probably going to be using it less like an actual tank and more like a fire support platform to support your infantry. This one is just a little bit tougher than the T-62. As an aside, I think I might have figured out the way the game formulates damage for AP rounds. It's worth noting that the Sable for pretty much all tanks in the game does 6 damage. That's what the 120mm guns in the US tanks do, the 125s on the Russian tanks do. They all do 6 damage. The 105s that the US have access to on the M10, the M60, the M8 AGS, and the Striker do 5.5 damage. And the 100mm gun on the BMOP, BMOP, does only 5 damage. I think the way the game has calculated this, or at least the formula that the developers are using, is they're taking the gun's caliber in millimeters and they're dividing it by 20. So 120 divided by 20 is going to be 6. 100 divided by 20 is going to be 5. And the even goes down quite low. The 25mm Bushmaster on the Bradley does 1.25 damage. 25 divided by 20 is 1.25. The 30mm on the 30mm Bushmaster 2 and the Russian 30mm 2A42 and 2A72 do 1.5 damage. Again, 30 divided by 20 is 1.5. The 50mm on the M10, that does 2.5 damage. And even the 57mm guns that Russia has access to does 2.9. Now this is interesting because I think this is because 57 divided by 20 is 2.85. So what I think they've done here is they've rounded up. And you've also might be asking, well, what about the 125mm guns the Soviets have, or the 105mm guns that I mentioned that the US has? 105 shouldn't be 5.5, it should be 5.25. And again, I think this is where they basically rounded it for simplicity's sake, just like with the Russians. They've rounded it down to 6 instead of 6.25, I believe. Yes, 6.25. Thank you, calculator built into the computer. Anyway, this kind of stands to reason that with the 115mm gun that T-62s were usually armed with, you're probably looking at damage values of probably around 5.5, but you can make an argument for 6. In reality, it should be 5.75, but you can possibly make an argument for 6. The 125mm gun on the T-64 would probably still do 6. However, what's interesting is that when you try and apply this damage formula to other guns, I have mentioned the 90mm Cockerel gun in the last video when I was talking about the light infantry specialization. That, theoretically, if it's firing a Sabot AP shell, which if memory serves the 90mm guns, or at least some of them could fire, would do 4.5 damage. But this also gets interesting if you try to apply it to larger guns. So the German Rheinmetall RH-130 that they've been toying around with the KF-51 is 130 millimeter gun, which would do 6.5 damage, at least according to this formula. The 140 millimeter guns, the very large 140 millimeter guns that the US, the Germans, and the Swedes toyed with towards the end of the Cold War, would do 7 damage. Yeah, 7 damage according to this formula. And the 152 millimeter guns that Russia has occasionally made mention of putting on the T-14, and I believe there was some consideration of arming some of their late Cold War era tanks with 152 millimeter guns as well, would probably do 7.5 damage, maybe rounded down instead of like 7.1, I believe. Or no, it would be 7.6, not 7.1. So they would probably round it down to like 7.5 damage, which would be kind of interesting, all things considered. I've seen some people asking about the 152mm gun option on the T-14, and I'm not necessarily opposed, just so long as we get the option of mounting a 140mm gun on something like an Abrams. Maybe if we do eventually get something like the M1A3 in game, with what is likely going to have a, well, I say likely, it may or may not have an unmanned turret, then we could either have an option between a 120 and 140mm gun. But that's probably a long way off. Anyway, I can't think of anything else that you could put in the vehicle tab. Upgrade-wise, you could probably fit the T-62 and the T-64 with something like Droid. The same active protection system that you have on the T-80U, if memory serves, in the Guards Tank Battalion Specialization. As for the ATGM vehicle, you might have an option of fitting that with Cornet M's, because the Cornet D1 in the VDV specialization only has the basic Cornet. If you want to go with the Cornet M's, you have an entirely different launcher. I suppose you could fit this one with the basic Cornets and then have an option to upgrade it to the Cornet M's. As for support, this is where things can get very interesting, because unlike the SOCOM specialization, this specialization would have a decent amount of this specialization would actually have a pretty deep support tab. As an aside, I've seen some people ask why you couldn't have like a Russian version of SOCOM, and the answer is that after Operation Eagle Claw, which is the failed attempt to rescue the hostages held in the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, otherwise known as the Iranian hostage crisis, the U.S. military basically organized a Special Operations Command, or SOCOM, and the idea was that they would coordinate the operations from the different special forces units in different branches. So initially, the Air Force, the Navy, the Army all joined in. The Marine Corps was hesitant; they didn't want to join SOCOM, and this lasted until after the 1991 Gulf War. Mainly, it lasted until the Marine Corps Special Forces units were basically sidelined in the opening stages of the Gulf War and just weren't used because they weren't a part of SOCOM. And you could not easily coordinate their actions like you could with special forces from the other three branches. So they were basically told to sit that one out. The Marines, being Marines, didn't particularly like that very much, so they joined SOCOM after the Gulf War. From my understanding, it isn't so much that the Special Forces units are under SOCOM's command, or within SOCOM's command structure. Like, they're still assigned to their own parent branch, but they can, depending on operational necessities, be transferred to the SOCOM command structure, is my understanding of it. I'm probably getting it wrong in a few places, but that's my understanding of it. Anyway, I digress. Support. You're going to have some interesting options here. Firstly, would be the BM-27, the Uragan. This is an 8-wheeled rocket launcher with a bank of 16 220mm rockets. What you're looking at is probably something like would be kind of similar to the M270 or the HIMARS, at least in rocket size and probably rocket damage, although I expect rocket range to be a little bit disappointing. So maybe 4 to 4.5 kilometer range. It seems like Russian rockets usually have have shorter ranges than their US counterparts anyway. Or after all, rather. So the BM-27 would be your basic, for lack of a better term, rocket artillery vehicle. You could treat it kind of like the Grad in that you have several options between basic HE, thermobaric slash cluster, and maybe incendiary, and heck, maybe even smoke. But the idea is that it's a basic rocket artillery vehicle. Again, kind of like the Grad. If you think about it, if you think of it kind of like an upsized Grad, you probably couldn't go too far wrong. The next vehicle, and this one I think is particularly interesting, would be the BM-27M. This is, from my understanding, this is a sort of a deep modernization of the BM-27. Instead of having a single launch rack with 16 220mm rockets, this thing would have two different sizes of rockets that you could pick from. You could either pick 12 300mm rockets, so we're talking about something like the Tornado S here. Is it Tornado S or Tornado G? I think the Tornado G is the 122 millimeter rocket version. Anyway, I digress. But you would have the large 300 millimeter rockets. These would probably be guided, much like with on the Tornado S, and you'd have 12 of them. So I expect the price to be, again, around the Tornado S, about 275. The next option would be interesting. And it's worth noting that the way the BM-27 works is that you can install two banks of rockets, either two banks of six 300 millimeter launch tubes, or two banks of 15 220 millimeter launch tubes. So you could potentially have 30 220 millimeter rockets. 30 220 millimeter rockets. Yeah, that's going to be a lot of firepower, and could be kind of fun. If I describe the BM-27 as like a souped-up Grad, then this could basically be thought of as a mega Grad. Although I don't think you would have the same selection of ammunition. You might have an extended range rocket, so maybe go from 4,000 to 4,500 meters, which is something you may also get with the basic BM-27 as well. But you probably wouldn't have things like incendiary, thermobaric, cluster, or smoke. What you would have is that you would have 30 rockets on standby that you can just blanket an area in high explosive with. So I don't necessarily think you're gonna miss much. Even if, yes, the stupidness of having 30 incendiary rockets is not lost on me. Although I do expect the system to be kind of expensive in the 250 to 300 point mark. I suppose it would largely depend on the kind of rockets that you have. I mean, heck, you may even have an option of just mounting the BM-30 Smirch style rockets for the slightly shorter range and lacking laser guidance, but again, making it slightly cheaper. On the subject of rocket artillery, another system you would have would be the TOS-2. This is a 3-axle chassis, it's not tracked, it's wheeled, with a launcher for 18 220mm rockets. I suppose you could think of it as kind of like a mini TOS. Now, as for what kind of upgrades this would have compared to the regular TOS, whether it'd be more like the TOS 1 or the TOS 1A, or whether or not you would have an option between like the TOS 1 or an option similar to the TOS 1 with the same kind of range, or an option with the extended range like the TOS 1A, I don't know. That said, the vehicle could basically act in the same role, in that it's primarily throwing thermobaric slash incendiary rockets. Honestly, if they give the TOS incendiary rockets, that would probably be too. That would probably be ridiculously OP. I mean, the TOS itself is already a bit hard to balance. They have nerfed it multiple times since the game came out. Anyway, I digress. The TOS 2, again, it's a 6-wheel chassis. It has an 18 tube pod on the back for the 220mm thermobaric rockets that the TOS can fire. You'll probably have an option between having the basic range TOS rockets, which I think is 1.6 kilometers, and then the extended range version, which is 2.4. There's also reference to something called the TOS 3, which appears to again be a tank chassis, but with a box that only has 15 rockets. Now, I don't expect this to be in this specialization, but you could probably add it to another specialization, and it would again serve the same basic role, except this thing only has 15 rockets compared to the 24 on the TOS 1A and the 30 on the TOS 1. So maybe kind of like a sort of a cheap toss that you can add to maybe mechanized infantry. And again, you could also probably go. You could also probably do what I was describing with the Toss 2, and that you have a basic version with the same range as the Toss 1, and then an upgrade to give it the range as the Toss 2, or the Toss 1A, I mean. As for air defense, this is where things could get a little bit interesting. Because you have things like the ZSU 50. Is it ZSU 57 2? Yes, it's ZSU 57 2. This is basically a twin 57mm gun mounted on a T-54 chassis. It's the same S60 gun that you have on things like the BMOP or the Kamaz. No, the Ural 4340, if memory serves. And that's basically what it is. It's just like a T-54 chassis, a pair of S60s, and in a relatively thinly armored and open-top turret. You could use it kind of like either an anti-aircraft vehicle in much the same way that you would use the S60 on the BMOP or the Ural, or a fire support vehicle. Again, much like you would use it on the BMOP or the Ural. I don't expect it to be especially heavily armored. Yes, it is a tank chassis, but we're talking about a tank from the Stalin era, or at least the tank the development of which started in the Stalin era. Plus, it has a large, thinly armored turret on top. So, survivability, probably not great. Another system, which could be interesting and would probably be more survivable, would be the ZSU 37 2 Yenitsy. If I pronounced that correctly, I probably didn't. This was developed around the same time as the ZSU 23 4, and it was supposed to be a sort of a complement to it. As the name implies, it has a pair of 37mm autocannons, and it would have used I don't think it was a tank chassis specifically, but it would have used a tracked chassis in a turret with a built-in radar system, kind of like the ZSU 23 4. Apparently, the prototype worked really, really well, but it was also really, really expensive. So the Soviets decided to just go with the 23 4 alongside and keep the 57 2 in service. What this thing would probably, or how this thing would probably work in game, would probably be similar to the 23 4, in that you might have a basic option that has the radar and the two 37mm guns, and then you might have another option with a quartet of man pads, kind of like you have an option of mounting on the Shilka. Honestly, I have no idea which one it is. This would be an interesting air defense platform, I think. Another anti-aircraft vehicle would be on the before mentioned Tiger chassis. There's a version of that has a quartet of manpads, either Iglas or Verbas. So that could probably act as like a light SAM, or not SAM, but a light air defense vehicle, which could be kind of interesting. Maybe something again that's light and relatively cheap, but not particularly the greatest capability. As for big SAMs, the main one that I can think of would be the S400. Now, this one probably isn't going to be all that hard to actually implement in the game. What you're likely looking at is something akin to the S300 PM, that's just more expensive and with a 4,500 meter range. So you're probably looking at the same basic vehicle. The missile performance is largely going to be the same, but instead of a 4 kilometer range, you might be looking at a 4.5 kilometer range, and maybe a 250 point price tag. This, along with the Typhon system, is one of the reasons why I recommended that big SAMs have their ranges extended, or their view range against high altitude targets extended from 4,000 meters up to 4,500 meters. Because beyond that, you would have a weapons range that is longer than your vision range. Thus, the extra weapons range would be a bit pointless. And besides, we don't have S400 in the game, and this would probably be a good way to actually fit it in. As for logistics, there are a few things that could be done. For example, I think it was the Kamaz Typhoons. There was an 8x8 variant, there was a 4x4, a 6x6, and an 8x8 variant, and all three of them had cargo variants. Or rather, there was a 4x4, 6x6, and 8x8 chassis, and there were cargo variants on all three of those chassis. However, something that could be interesting would be, if memory serves, the Ural 7310. Wait, no, it's the Maz 7310, not the Ural's 7310. The Maz 7310 is, if I'm not mistaken, it is the base chassis for vehicles like the BM30 or the S300 PM, that large 8-wheeled chassis. There was actually a cargo variant of it, and it could apparently carry 15 metric tons of supplies. So you could use that basically as like a large transport vehicle in roughly the same category as something like the LVSR or the M1074, I believe. The Plus, the palletized load system. However, there was also another variant that could, if I'm not mistaken, there was an upgraded variant that could carry 22 metric tons of supplies, which would be a bit nuts. And I'm honestly not sure why you would need that much supplies, but I thought I would note it regardless. You could use that as like a very heavy transport truck. Lastly, moving on to the air tab, there were a few options that I could think to mention. The first would be the MiG-25, the second would be the MiG-31. The idea here is kind of like the F-14 Tomcat, in that what you have is a very high speed, or well, yeah, it's kind of like the Tomcat in that it's a very high speed interceptor. Aside from that, however, the similarities usually end there. In game, it would probably act like it would be really fast, but I don't expect its fuel capacity to be especially large, maybe only 2 minutes of loiter time. You would probably have the MiG-25 as your basic variant that could only carry a relatively small number of air-to-air missiles, but would also be cheaper, and then the MiG-31 would be larger and would be able to carry more missiles. Another aircraft you might have is, if I'm remembering the designation correctly, the MiG-31K. This is a MiG-31 that was specifically, or rather, this is the designation for MiG-31s that have been specifically modified to carry the KH-47M2, otherwise known as the Kinzhal. This is basically an air-launched ballistic missile. It's basically the top half of like an Iskander that has been sling-loaded under a MiG-31. Now, unlike the other MiG-31s, you wouldn't have the option of mounting any air-to-air missiles on this thing. In fact, the ability to use the MiG-31 as an air-to-air platform was completely removed when the K modifications were put in place. However, you could use this as kind of like a strike platform. So you might have an option for the KH-47 of equipping it with conventional HE, cluster, thermobaric, and maybe even a nuclear warhead to give Russia another nuclear delivery mechanism. Of course, being a ballistic missile, it's still vulnerable to interception by things like SAMs, but it would be a novel way of deploying ballistic missiles. Let's just leave it at that. I mean, after all, the service record of the Kinzhal isn't anything to write home about. Other aircraft you could incorporate might include things like the S-70 Okhotnik. This, maybe you could treat something kind of like the RQ-170, but with weaponry. Now, to be fair, this is not a small drone. The S-70 is about fighter-sized. It's also not the stealthiest thing in the world. The engine exhaust nozzle is exposed, at least in the pictures that were released to the public, although I believe Russia has made a variant with a shielded engine exhaust nozzle, kind of like what you see on stealthy UCAVs. So what you might actually have is an option to upgrade the stealth from 1.25 to maybe 1.75, but you would make the platform more expensive. As for how it would work in game, it would probably work something kind of like the F-117, in that it's a stealthy platform, but with a relatively small amount of ordnance for you to that you can drop from it. The last option, and I'm going to include this for the sake of completeness, even though if I'm going to be entirely honest, I don't actually expect to make it into the game, would be the Su-75. I suppose you could treat this kind of like an F-35 analog. The aircraft would be well, basically an F-35 analog. I believe I've already talked about this in one of the previous videos. The idea that I have is to kind of treat it like an Su-57, but with only one weapons bay instead of two, so that everything you could fit in one Su-57's weapons bay, you can fit on the Su-75. It's just that you only have one weapons bay to customize and not two. So three R-37s, or not R-37s, three R-77s, two R-37s, two air-launched cruise missiles, two anti-radiation missiles, two laser-guided bombs, or whatever else fits in a single weapons bay on the Su-57, you can fit on the Su-75. And like the Su-57, you might have a pair of short-range air-to-air missiles as a weapon that is fixed, for lack of a better word, to the aircraft that you can't actually take off, like the two R-73s that are fixed to the Su-57. That said, I honestly don't expect this aircraft to make it into the game, mainly because we don't actually have a functioning prototype yet. And I'm aware I have previously suggested systems that do not have a functioning prototype, such as the ground combat vehicle in my first video. The thing is, however, the ground combat vehicle, and the reason why I suggested the ground combat vehicle, even though we don't have a physically built prototype, there's honestly two reasons. Firstly, it would act as a U.S. counterpart to the T-15. And secondly, the vehicle was never built, but there was no hard constraint for why it wasn't. The problem is that the Su-75 exists in a sort of state of limbo. Russia can't build any without foreign sales. Basically, they need to sell the aircraft in order to build the aircraft. So in order to build the aircraft, they need to have some export customer go, oh yeah, sure, I want some of that. But the aircraft doesn't even exist in the first place. Now, I'm not saying the aircraft can't exist. I think it could if Rostec were given a whole bunch of money. I think they could build an Su-75. But it still exists in this weird kind of limbo. That said, if I am going to include things like the GCV, I think it is only fair if I include things like the Su-75. Even though, personally, I don't think the Su-75 is going to be built in as a functional prototype, at least not anytime soon. And even if it is built as a functional prototype, I think it is going to be a long, long time before it enters service, if it ever does. In short, in the early 2010s, if the Army had turned to BAE and GDLS and said, alright, build GCV prototypes, they could have done so. Right now, I don't think Russia could actually build a functioning Su-75 prototype. Anyway, and I suppose that if you're going to include aircraft like the S-70, you can make an argument for aircraft like the X-47B or the XQ-58 for US specialization. But I'm honestly not sure which. I suppose you could fit them in the Fleet Marine Forces specialization, but that already has a pretty full air tab as is. Another alternative would be fitting them in the light infantry specialization, but again, you don't have, or I say again, but you don't have many aircraft points to play with in that specialization to begin with. Anyway, I digress. So that's pretty much it. Pretty much everything I have for that specialization. My plan after that, once this video comes out, is to make a video looking at the announcements that they make for the future of the game. I'll probably post that in a week after this video comes out. Ideally, this video is going to come out this Saturday, the 22nd, I think. Let me check. Yes, the 22nd. So on the 29th, I'll probably post a video looking at the roadmap and where they want to take the game. I suspect that's going to include at least some information about new specializations. I don't know what those specializations are going to be, but I wanted to get these videos out before any of that information comes out. Well, if I'm going to be entirely honest, half the reason why I wanted to get these out before they talk about the future of the game and release roadmaps and potential news about new specializations was so that if anything that they release is similar to the stuff that I speculated, and I say that, then nobody, I mean, well, that's assuming anyone's ever going to watch these videos, but nobody can come back and just say, "Oh yeah, you're just saying that you were retroactive, or you're just saying that you were right retroactively." Her. But anyway, this video series was actually a pretty interesting experience, if I'm going to be entirely honest. Editing these large videos was very, very interesting. If anyone ever does watch this, I'm pretty sure they're going to notice the differences in audio quality. And the reason for that is because sometimes I need to re-record a bit, sometimes I misspoke and I need to re-record a bit. Sometimes I have a new idea and I need to insert that right in the middle of the audio clip. However, it's also a giant pain in the butt. And it takes Minitool like 7 or 8 hours to export those last two videos. I assume because they had all of those other video inserts, and plus they were 2 hours long, and they had separate audio, and they had a bunch of text notes. Still, I don't imagine it would take Minitool nearly as long to export this one, but it's still probably gonna take a while. Anyway, honestly, there are things I could have done better. I know that in the second video, I screwed up the layout of the audio at one point because I believe I go from talking about a hypothetical MGS style version of the ACV, and then I go talking about boats, and then I talk about how just because something is hypothetical doesn't mean that it shouldn't be in the game because it's just a game. The thing about the hypotheticals should have been between the MGS version of the ACV and the boats, if memory serves. But yeah, overall, this was a pretty interesting little series. I did actually have an idea regarding some of the specializations I talked about last time, in the second video, that is. The Hawk system and the M727 was actually used by the Marine Corps. So what you could potentially do is, instead of putting the Hawk in the light infantry specialization, you could basically put the Hawk in the current Marine Corps specialization and then move the PAC-2 Patriot over to the light infantry specialization. I mean, that's one thing I suppose you could do. Personally, I still stand by what I said in the Update 1.10 video, where they should have just given Armor Brigade Specialization the PAC-3 MSC, and then given Striker Cav the PAC-2, and just let it keep the PAC-3. Because that kind of cemented Striker Cav's idea of being a primarily support-focused specialization. That said, I can kind of understand why they took Striker Cav in the direction that they took it. I mean, it's cavalry. Cavalry in a... Am I using that word right? Right? I'm not sure. Anyway, the point is that you're supposed to have a bunch of light mobile infantry. And if you have a bunch of points tied into the support tab, you're not going to be able to field as much light mobile infantry. I understand that. I understand why they did it. I'm still a little bit upset about it. Because I like the idea of a support specialization. When they made a post on Steam in April, they mentioned that there was a US support specialization. That sounds awesome! I mean, there's a whole bunch of fun tools that you can use, and a lot of them I laid out in the light infantry specialization. The only problem with the light infantry specialization, the way I see it, the only thing that keeps that from being a heavy support-focused specialization with some light infantry to help back it up, is the lack of a good high-mat air defense system. Like the PAC-2 Patriot. If they took the PAC-2 Patriot and maybe something like the Sparrowhawk I mentioned in the last video, treating it like a book analog, and they put that in the light infantry specialization, that'd be a great support specialization. You have a variety of artillery systems. Sure, you don't have any rocket artillery, but, well, okay, you don't have any rocket artillery. I suppose you could maybe swap out the M270 for the M110. Like, give the M110 to Armor Brigade and give the M270s to light infantry. But, yeah. Honestly, you're splitting hairs at that point, because really, depending on what specialization you pair it up with, you're still probably going to have a decent amount of artillery. You may not necessarily have rocket artillery, but you're still going to have some decent artillery. Anyway, I digress. I went off on a tangent there. That tends to happen. So, I guess I'm just waiting to see what comes out on the 25th, I think they said.